Enzo, welcome to the stage.
Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining and making the time this afternoon for me and this morning, I think, for those on stateside. I'm going to share my screen in a second, but just to give you a very short introduction of who I am and what I do at the Financial Times. So I'm Enzo Diliberto. I'm the Global Insight Director at the Financial Times. I head up the FT's Commercial Insight team, which supports our advertising teams globally. And we kind of summarize the work that we do in kind of four key pillars. The first is around audience insight. So we have a lot of research that we run mainly amongst the FT audience to understand how they consume our platforms, our different channels, and then a broad range of topics. We also have sort of a second pillar around ad effectiveness. So we have various levers that we can pull on to help measure the efficacy of campaigns. We also run a series of brand studies, which some of you on this call may be familiar with, called the GIST franchise. These are global impact studies. These are market trackers, and I would say that we're very well, the finance sector is very well served through our battery of studies that we run. And then finally, we run each year a piece of thought leadership, which is what I'm going to share with you today. So my first challenge is to share my screen, and hopefully this works. And then I'll kick off with some of the findings. So hopefully this is working, which I think it is. So let me kick off. So today I'll be taking you through our latest thought leadership piece of research, which we ran this year with the IPA, the Institute for Practitioners for Advertising. It's called Bridging the Trust Gap. It's all about the importance of trust in business, the building blocks of trust. We also look at trust across different sectors, including the finance sector. And ultimately, we look at how media can play a part in helping brands build trust. So hopefully you'll find the findings helpful. We, in the post-webinar, but also at the end of this presentation, there is a QR code where you can download the full report. So why did we run the research? I think Ashley touched on a lot of these points in the introduction. Well, we've been discussing this for some time, and I think it's fair to say that trust is now more important than ever, with the backdrop of misinformation, geopolitical uncertainty, and the rise of AI in 2025. So we wanted to gauge how trust is, how key trust is for businesses and how it helps them thrive. Trust is often taken for granted, but it can be a brand's most powerful asset, which is something that we discovered in the research and we speak about anecdotally. And we've got some data that shows how it really affects profitability and a company's bottom line. In terms of what's covered in the study specifically and what I'll be taking you through in the next 15 minutes, we look at the importance of trust. We look at the building blocks of trust and the benefits of organizational trust from both a consumer and a company perspective. We look at trust across different sectors and also trust in AI. And vitally, the role that media can play in helping brands build trust. So let me kick off with my very first methodology slide, just to give you an idea of how we ran the research. So the research and white paper launched in June of this year. We launched the study in Cannes with the IPA. But the fieldwork was carried out towards the end of last year and dipping into 2025. The survey went to FT readers globally. They are broadly business decision makers, a robust sample. We've got over 757 to be specific, to be exact. And in short, they are global in nature. They are senior, with over a third being in the C-suite category. And they come from various industry sectors and regions. While I'll be taking you through the global findings today, in the white paper and in the actual long form report, we do pull out some variances in the data by different demographics in the study. So the first section is to help us understand just how important trust is for organizations. But before I launch into the FT-IPA study of those 757 responses, I thought it might be useful to share with you a longitudinal study which my team runs called the Audience Barometer Study, which we've been running since March 2020. And according to this study, which we run on a quarterly basis, trust has always been one of the most important core corporate messages to communicate to stakeholders, and saw a sharp increase in 2025. Now, jumping straight into the FT-IPA study, one of the first things we asked our FT business decision makers in the study is, do you feel the importance of trust in organizations has changed in the past 5 years? And they were pretty confident it had. 64%, so almost 2/3, agreed that trusting companies is much more important nowadays and clearly vital for company success. So clearly the natural follow-up to this is asking why. Why is trust in companies more important nowadays? And FT business decision makers we interviewed cited various reasons. Just to summarize the slide for you, greater access to customer data, a reduction in human interaction, which is the common thread we see throughout this presentation, and data security issues have led to trust becoming more important. And on the right there, we have, you can see a comment from one of our FT readers who, if you ever read the comments section in any of our articles, they're very vociferous in their comments, but I think it quite nicely encapsulates some of the thinking behind the reasons why they see trust as being more important. So moving away from the data for a second here, another illustration of, and this is in the main report, why trust is important, is when we look at the share price of the most trusted brands. Some of you may be aware of this, but this is the Trust 200 index at the top of this line chart. And it's a US equity stock index tracking the 200 most trustworthy public companies in the US. It's compiled by a research group called Trust Across America. And I think this nicely highlights that more trustworthy companies outperform less trustworthy ones financially. So it's just to highlight another reason why trust is important, using an independent source here, that trusted companies are more likely to grow and carry a lower, longer-term risk to potential investors and outperform the S&P 500. So back to the research now. So it was interesting to see in the study that less than half of the respondents said that their company actively measures its trust levels, 49% in fact. And a further question highlighted that 22% state that trust is a board KPI in their company, only 22%. On the right there is a direct quote from the report, which comes from the IPA effectiveness database. So there's clearly a disconnect here that you can see from the research already. Business decision makers are telling us that trust is highly important. They're citing the reasons as to why it's important. And yet many companies don't have a gauge on their trust levels or how indeed they are measuring it. So that's clearly something that needs addressing. Moving on to the second section, which looks at the building blocks of trust and how trust is created. When asked which factors business decision makers cited as being the most important in establishing trust in an organization, we can see the top 6 ranked areas that are considered to be most important. Reliability, consistency, competent human interaction, data security, ethics and responsibility, and transparency ranked highest. So just to break this down for you, reliability and consistency are extremely important. Customers trust brands which get the job done and deliver on their promises, which is pretty basic really, but extremely important in establishing trust in an organization. Human interaction factor rings true here again. And it is perhaps not surprising that with the increase in the collection of data, particularly on digital platforms, that business decision makers see data security as increasingly important when building trust with brands. And again, on the right-hand side here, you can see a quote from the full report from a leader in the media industry. We also looked at the benefits looked at what are the benefits to the organization when it has high levels of trust. And on the next slide, we'll show you the benefit to the customer. So we already saw that trusted companies have increased market share and has a positive effect on their bottom line. But further, the benefit is that they gain customer loyalty, they create a stronger brand, and importantly, they can attract and retain top talent, which gives them a competitive edge. As mentioned, we also looked at this from the benefit to the customer when they can trust an organization. Customers feel confident to use those companies on repeat and recommend them to peers. Customers can be more agile and make quicker decisions if they trust an organization or a vendor. They can quickly use them again and move on to the next task. And there is also an increased potential for collaboration to work with businesses, to share learnings and discover new ideas. In the next section, we look at trust levels across different industry sectors, and of course, asked about trust in the context of AI, given its rise in recent years. And I always say that currently that no research presentation is complete with at least one slide on AI. So firstly, we asked respondents, FT readers, to rate trust levels they had in the following industries. And you can see here the scores that we received those that consider that these industries have high levels of trust. So, for example, here you can see property agents, perhaps unsurprisingly, have low levels of trust, but also tabloid news and government. Whereas business news, food, cybersecurity, they were the most trusted industries in the study, and people were more likely to have confidence in those sectors to deliver on their promises. Now, apologies, this is probably the most complicated slide on here, but I'll talk you through it as simply as I can. But what we did here was we took the data from the previous slide and layered this on with the second question, which read, how important is trust when engaging or selecting an organization in these industries? So you can see the level of trust people have in those industries in the light blue, which is the data I showed you on the previous slide. And then in the dark blue, just how important trust is for that sector to function. And then the red line, or the difference, is what we are calling the trust gap. So areas like retail and business news, for instance, they look to be doing okay with less of a gap to the importance of trust in that sector and to current trust levels. But obviously they could still do more. But when you look at something like the finance sector, for example, there appears to be some work to do. Trust is highly important in this sector, but the current trust levels don't match up with how important trust levels are to that sector. So trying to make this relevant, we've now pulled in some data from those brand studies I mentioned at the beginning, the GIST studies. How can we help understand how financial organizations might want to bridge this trust gap? Well, firstly, I'd remember the top drivers of trust from earlier, which are on the left of this chart here. Organizations need to demonstrate reliability, keeping the human touch, and champion data security. On top of this, when we look at our global impact studies, which we conduct across many different sectors, particularly in the finance sector, we can actually add another layer of data onto this slide. On the right-hand side is an example of a data point taken from our asset management brand tracking study, where we look at attributes considered the most important when selecting an asset management firm to work with. And readers in our study cite things like investment performance, fees, and financial stability as key drivers of consideration. So when communicating in this space, potentially forming some messaging around these themes, as well as the building blocks of trust from the FT IPA research, would help and could help bridge the trust gap. As mentioned, the study also asked about AI specifically. We had a whole battery of attitudinal statements. We asked respondents the extent to which they agreed or disagreed with a whole raft of AI-related statements. Here's just two. So these two data points suggest that companies need to be cautious in their deployment of AI. For example, on the left here, you can see that 92% of the sample agreed that if a company were to misuse AI, it would have a profound effect on the level of trust that they had with the company. And on the right-hand side of this slide, you can see that currently 55% do not trust AI-generated content. So it'll be interesting to see how companies build trust in a world where AI usage is increasing. It's obviously here to stay, but our research shows that there is some trepidation from our business decision maker readers at the moment on its usage. And my final section before I hand back to Ashley is looking at the role that media can play in helping companies build trust. Well, firstly, we asked respondents which media channels they see as the most trusted, and this is looking at on a 5-point scale, which have the highest level of trust. You might be saying, well, this is an FT study, so perhaps not surprising, but international news brands are seen as the most trusted, which I think you can see is in stark contrast to influencers and social platforms. It's clear that for some social platforms who have recently removed fact-checking and greater control of their content, they are seeing lower levels of trust than they might have once seen. Now, moving away from the FT-IPA study, this is just another study that my team runs called the Media Landscape study, which we recently launched. But just to add some color to the previous slide, when looking at the Media Landscape study, we see that accuracy is the most important attribute of a trustworthy news source, which I think ties in quite nicely with the reliability and consistency point made earlier. We also looked at specific media brands and which were the most trusted. We do have a much longer list. I think we've got something in the region of 20 brands that we measure. This is looking at the highest level of trust. And what came out generally, again, was that international media brands or publishers were seen as the most trusted. The FT on this slide, as you can see, scored highly, but this is just looking at those that scored highest in the study. When you combine the 4 and 5 scores, the 69% for the FT jumps to 93, but in truth, The Economist and Bloomberg also have very strong trust levels. As I said, in the full study, in the full report, you can look at the full list, but this just gives you a very quick snapshot of the top 7. We also introduced this concept of gatekeeper media brands in the study and asked if an advertiser wanted to build trust, how important are gatekeeper media brands to the media plan? So we defined gatekeeper media brands on the study as those who control 100% of the content on their platforms, with content signed off by editorial teams and nothing is user generated on there, notwithstanding user comments. FT readers on the study once again agree that when it comes to building trust, gatekeeper media brands or publishers should be part of the media plan. In the blue, it's 59% agree that they are an important element. And just to add to this, this was true of all regions of the data, especially strong in Europe. And finally, on this slide, you can see the benefit of this for advertisers, which is what we call the halo effect. We asked, how would your views of a company change if they had advertised and aligned with a trusted media brand? And the research shows that 60% in the orange agree that the advertiser would be viewed as more trustworthy when taking that approach. And these last few slides combined give us a clear media strategy to help build trust. So if an advertiser partners with a reliable, trusted media brand who controls 100% of the content on their platforms, then the advertiser by proxy inherits some of that trust and is more trusted as a result. And one more final additive point here is that this was true of all ages in the data. Even the younger cohort for the research agreed that aligning with trusted media brands does indeed help to improve your trust credentials. So that's enough from me. Those were the highlights from the Bridging the Trust Gap research. I hope you found it interesting. As I mentioned, we do have a full white paper of the findings, which we co-wrote with the IPA and goes into a lot more detail. For the eager in the crowd, you can use the QR code on screen or the link to access the report. I think in the post-webinar comms, there will be a link to this as well. So if you haven't got your phone to hand, then not to worry. That's it from me. Thank you again for listening. I'm now going to hand back to Ashley for the fireside chat with Lindsay and Erin. Thank you.
Thank you, Enzo. That was a really compelling conversation. I'm interested to know what did you find most interesting in that research as you dug into it. I know you dig through a lot of research, so I'm curious. And let's get Lindsay and Erin on stage, and we'll start this conversation in just a second. But Enzo, what all did you find interesting in that? What was the most interesting thing you thought in that particular piece?
Well, I think the thing that we found, and when we were putting together the sort of the methodology and the sort of I guess some theories when we put together the research at the sort of planning stage, that there were so many different ways that you could look at or approach this study. For instance, we were looking at tenure or length of the organization's been in existence, for example. Does that play a part? So the whole heritage, and which lends itself to more trust or more authenticity. An established brand is much more likely to be trusted than others. I think what we quickly realized is that it's obviously very subjective. Just asking the straight question, is a brand trustworthy? There are many different layers behind that, which is why we introduced the concept of the building blocks, reliability, consistency. There are many factors that play into a brand being trusted and maintaining their trust levels. But I think what was also interesting, and this sounds like I'm plugging the report now, is bringing in sort of industry commentary and actually showing that there is evidence in market, not just from the IPA, but also the trust index that I showed you, to show that there is a direct correlation between most trusted brands and their financial performance. So I'd say, in a nutshell, that was probably the most interesting part of it.
Yes, I imagine you have some interesting data tables. At some point, I'd love to dig into that with you. But let's go ahead and jump into our sort of wider discussion. Erin and Lindsay, welcome to the stage. I'm going to ask you each to introduce yourselves. So Erin, we'll start with you. Give us just a quick introduction, who you are, what you do.
Sure thing. Thank you. Actually, happy to. Good morning, everyone. So my name is Erin Randolph. I'm SVP of Marketing and Communications at Bailard. So that means I lead our brand and communications across both our wealth and asset management businesses. And I think that's probably the best quick answer for you.
Sure, and I'm Lindsay DeLarme. I run marketing and communications at Oaktree Capital. We're an alternative investment manager with over 200 billion in assets under management.
Fantastic. I appreciate you both joining us for this conversation, and we're just going to start sort of setting the stage with, what is it about trust that makes it sort of a competitive differentiator, and specifically in your business, how do you think about trust, and where does that sort of fall in terms of your priorities as a communicator?
Sure. For us at Bailard, we're part of that 49% that Enzo mentioned that we don't formally report on trust as a KPI. The way we think about it, it's not necessarily we need this to be a differentiator, right? It's more how we operate. So when we talk about trust at Bailard, it's more how we work together internally, and I think from where I sit, there's a very noticeable way that plays out. It's really that we know we can't expect perfection, right? But instead, we're always starting from a place of trust. And so what that means is that we expect people, feel comfortable speaking up early if something's drifting so that we can fix it together, do right by our clients. And I think it's really that combo of accountability, compassion, fairness that just comes through kind of in the day-to-day. And that's where it's built for us. And I think, trust it's built long before marketing shows up. And I think from thinking about, trust at our company too, I'll just say that it's actually been enjoyable to prepare for today, which is not always the case, right? It's interesting. The subject matter is really just, I think, close to us in general. I think for me, I much more prefer prepping our SMEs behind the scenes, but I think it's been a good opportunity, and I think a good one for everyone to think about.
And at Oaktree, trust is just part of our DNA. So it's actually part of our mission statement. We talk about operating our business to the highest integrity. And so it's really part of our brand promise to our clients. And so it's a cornerstone of everything that we do. So every communication that we work on, it has to have these pillars of trust behind it. And so that's communicating in good times and in bad, and sticking true to your knitting and being true to who you are, even when sometimes that's not the most popular opinion. And I think if you build trust that way, and you do what you say you're going to do, and your actions support your words, I think you build that trust with your clients. And that's really the long-term piece of the brand building around trust.
Absolutely. So interestingly, you sort of both touched on a subject that I think is particularly interesting and relevant. This group has been having the conversation for a long time about, how your internal communications and your internal messaging impacts what is seen externally. And you each talked about sort of ingrained culture, but also sort of your internal comms plan and strategy, and kind of how that plays out. So can you talk a little bit about how you're using internal comms as sort of a day-to-day tool to encourage trust, and what signals inside do you look for to know if you're doing the right work there?
I can go first on this one. So, employee communications, I think a lot of us probably handle employee communications just as much as we do external communications. And since trust is such an important part of Oaktree, it's inside and out, and it actually starts probably inside and resonates outwards. And so, internally, it's important that all of our employees, it's part of our performance reviews, that we instill trust in one another, and we're courageous, right? If you see something, say something. If there's a problem, let's address it head on. Let's be transparent. And it's about building that trust internally. And then if you have all of your employees operating in that way, where everyone is focused on building the trust within one another, that then goes on to the way that you treat your clients, and getting your clients to see that trust within one another, and then you're delivering on that brand promise to your external stakeholders. So one example is, let's say that there's something, things go wrong, right? Let's say that there's a fault with compliance or legal, or there's some kind of employee issue. We'll usually raise that to the surface so that all of our employees can learn from it, and we use it as a learning lesson, right? So what's the old communications adage, like never let a crisis go to waste. And use that with employee communications too, right? Like if something happens, it's unfortunate, right? You get an SEC fine, something like that. Let's blast it out to all of our employees and make everyone know this happened. This is what we learned from it. We take these things very seriously. And I think those actions, again, help support when you do what you say you're going to do, that's what builds that trust.
Yeah, and I think I can add on that too. It's, I think, very similar for us too, but it really, I think one path of that also is the willingness to slow down, right? And I think, there's just, it's a constant machine. And so really being able to say like, hold on, like, does what we're doing within, the heading of marketing comms, like, is that actually aligning with what we believe? Is that how we want to show up? Like, is that true to the values that are on the wall, right? I think a lot of us do have, the brand promise, the mission, the values for kind of the corporate level. I think my favorite parts of my job are when we actually get to promote and highlight something that speaks to that, right? That it's not just like, oh, we made up 6 cool words, but that like, these are the things that actually prove that we mean it. And I think that's, again, it really starts internally and being willing to say like, hey, this doesn't feel right. Can we spend some time? Maybe we need to talk to a few people or rethink this. And for me, I think that's like the biggest part there. And it's those moments that matter. It's being able to choose kind of the harder path. And I think having the comfort and ability to do that internally with your peers then means you're more willing to, pick up the phone for the harder client conversation or be willing to delay an external timeline because you want to do it right. And I think it's that path that really like reflects who you are. So it's, again, not a KPI, but I think that's just such a good signal of when that's happening naturally. It's just how you operate.
Yeah, and when you're developing external messaging campaigns, how much are you spending time on sort of also translating that? This is sort of, I'm adapting a question from Carla, who's in the audience here. But, how much are you spending time on adapting that to an internal message as well? Like, are you always kind of mirroring one to the other, or is sometimes some things are just internal, some things are just external? How's that working for you?
Well, I know at Oaktree, we have a very rigid order of operations. Employees learn first, then our clients, then external, right? And so it's always making sure that our key stakeholders know before there's a media report, right? We never want someone internally or one of our clients finding out about something when they're reading about it, online or in the newspaper. We want to control that message. And so a lot of times, because that first piece in our timeline is always the employee message, it starts with the employee message. And then you take the employee message and you refine it to the client message. And they're usually very similar. There are small tweaks on, the implications or, some of the thematic wording. But if you look at, our communications plans, the press release, the client communication, the employee communication, the guts are the same, just with a few tweaks for that audience. And I actually think that's really important because you want that messaging to stay the same through all of your audiences. And I think that's a really important, an important place to start.
Agreed. And I think the challenge is too, when you have different audiences too, right? You may kind of resonate with things differently, but where do you find that through line, right? Like, I think sometimes that's a challenge, whether it's internal, external, or retail, institutional, whatever it might be. That I think is the open or the big part for us. And it is that consistency between the message and just being clear about it. I think the biggest thing, it's not really like perfection, it's just honesty. And I think that really comes through. Like, we're all people, we've all got day jobs, like, and we're serving people as well, right? And so I think just understanding that, I think everyone's trying to get through their day, and that the way you do that is showing up day to day, right? And being consistent, being there, being available. So we wouldn't want to change that, have our clients see, some sort of external comms that doesn't seem like how it was presented to them, right? And I think that's where the distrust starts. It's like, okay, well, are you trying to con, the folks on the other side, or is it me? So yeah, just the clarity and consistency always.
Yeah, just to add to that, I completely concur. I think, customers expect and want honesty and to feel heard. I think it's the basic principles of any good relationship. I mean, I think, that's where I think it can transcend personal and professional, right? Because, the research suggests that reliability, consistently getting the job done, but actually being open and transparent and being authentic like that actually helps build strong trust in that person or organization. And I think also it's really interesting, the point around sort of having a clear culture, having a clear core brand value is how a brand is lived within and outside the company is really really interesting. And I think I can think of many examples of brands such as, I don't know, Virgin, for example, is one that springs to mind, where they really embody the brand, and actually that transcends through the organization, but also in their communication strategy.
Absolutely. Well, so coming back a little bit to the research, we talked about things like data reliability or data security, reliability, sort of ethics and responsibility as key drivers of trust in institutions in general, not just within finance. I know that sometimes, we operate in a very heavily regulated environment. Things like compliance, data security kind of maybe feel heavy in our marketing and comms development, but how are you reframing those or thinking about those as brand building or trust building opportunities today?
Yeah, it's funny. This is, I think, just from where I sit, but in the past, I've noticed I'm almost feeling like I have to apologize, right? There's an extra step, there's an extra hassle, but really it's being, I feel like that level of thoroughness sometimes almost feels like an inconvenience, right? But I think it's the level of care, and it shows sort of how seriously we take our responsibilities. So even I have to remind myself of that sometimes, right? Whether it's like, okay, no, this does need another layer of review, or we do need that extra verification. Every time I've had that conversation with a client, it's like, no, we get it. Like that's great, that's fine. So often I have to remind myself of that. But it really is one of those nice, again, proof points of like, we do take this seriously. We do want to safeguard your assets. It's, finance has its, aura around it, but at the end of the day, we're protecting and safeguarding something very personal to people. So I don't think you ever want that to come across as casual.
Yeah, Lindsay, what do you think on this?
Yeah, I mean, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of times we take some of these, let's say, missteps or footfalls, and we use them to help create that transparency and that authenticity. And especially around AI, it's, a new frontier, and people are learning how to use it. And data security, like these are really hot button issues, and they're new. And so people are exploring and kind of feeling them out and figuring out how to use them, and especially with our client information. And so I think around all of these things, you need to be really careful and be transparent and be communicative and learn from mistakes and learn what works and what doesn't. And as long as you're being as open as possible with the good and the bad, I think that that creates and builds that trust and authenticity with external and internal stakeholders.
And Enzo, what have you seen kind of across the industry on this?
Well, I think through a lot, not just this research, but other research where we've touched on this topic, is that, and I think it echoes some of the points that Lindsay and Erin mentioned, is that the worst thing you can do is bury your head in the sand. You need to address this front on, be honest, be transparent. Because in the long run, if you don't, then there are many examples of organizations that are going to be worse off in the long run. And I think it's just, and I mentioned this a few times in the presentation, it's just maintaining that level of human interaction is extremely important, making your customers feel like they're heard. I mean, we see this at the FT, there's nothing worse than a reader not being recontacted if they're in touch with us about either our editorial stance on certain things or even advertising that appears in the FT. Keeping those open lines of communication are key in terms of maintaining and recovering from periods of crises.
Yeah. Let's talk about human interaction. This was one of the points that Enzo, you made. And I know, I think that almost everyone in marketing communications is sort of grappling with the balance between some of the efficiency that we can see using new technologies. I think AI has helped us all in many ways with content production and things like that. But there's also sort of this line with human connection. And the research strongly made the point that if you sort of misstep and are overusing or certainly misusing AI, we're going to be in a lot of trouble. But so for everyone, how are you sort of balancing the efficiency with the need for the human connection? What has worked for sort of being able to scale a little bit better, but maintaining that human touch?
Yes, I can start. So yeah, I'll use events as an example. So, obviously during the pandemic, we all switched to virtual events and we got really used to doing webinars and things like these, but there's no replacement for human interaction. And, creating those in-person relationships and, seeing people face to face, it creates that kind of first bond, which then you can follow up and do more, virtual type of events and things like that. But I think creating that in-person interaction is really important. And I also think, so we've really focused on doing in-person events, and now we're coming back to webinars after, pivoting almost fully to in-person events. But I do think that's really important. And then also it's a lot about the people. So the more that you can lean into your leaders, when you talk about trust, it's hard to talk about trust at the corporate, right? It's hard to trust a company, but it's easy to trust a person. And so through thought leadership, through media, if you can highlight those key leaders and have the trust go through the individuals, I think that's a good way to build trust amongst your key spokespeople, which then helps build upon the trust at the company level. And so while, it's great to be able to put out a white paper or to do a webinar, you still need those in-person and, really personal types of communications to help enforce the trust.
Yeah. Sorry, please carry on, Erin.
I was just going to build on that too. I think, one of the ways I think that's really helpful is to kind of layer onto everything, right? It's when you do have the research and the white paper, it's, understanding and projecting sort of who wrote it, who is this person, what are they thinking, what's their deal, and giving kind of a face to it. And I think for us stepping back just a bit, automating the simple and the routine, but really just to make space for the human interaction. And I think that comes out in a lot of ways. On the client side, it's being able to actually go to the in-person meeting or taking that few extra minutes, or being able to sit down and say like, hey, my kid had a question, can we go over this? And I think being able to take care of some of the other stuff first so you actually have space for that is great. But even on a very specific personal note, as we're trying to get external comms out, right? Our thought leaders, our subject matter experts, they're super duper busy, right? And so for me, if there's things that can automate some of the other things that they're doing, that's where you then can have that time where they can make those connections, whether it's, clients or media or whatever it might be, that you can be able to sort of surface the actual people underneath.
Absolutely. Yeah. Enzo?
Thanks, Ashley. Yeah, I was just going to add, all the research that we've conducted to date is that obviously, businesses and organizations are clearly leaning into the deployment of AI in organization, mainly to, I guess in the last 12 months, it's been around sort of operational efficiencies, but I think striking that balance between AI adoption and maintaining the human interaction, which customers love, is a balance, which is, I think companies are still trying to work out how to balance those two. And to Lindsay's point, I think, we in our brand studies that we run, we have a series of questions, and it's particularly high in the finance category, where we ask about attributes associated with which we're in the purchase decision, or at least the selection of a firm to work with. And the people and the relationship side always features in the top three. It's clear, and in some cases, number one in certain regions. And I think that was quite, I think I completely agree. I think, it's hard to form a personal relationship with a brand, but that connection with people is important in instilling trust and maintaining trust, I think.
And we talked a little bit about this on the prep call, but I think, we've all been through performance peaks and valleys, right? And so for your clients to stay with you in the bad times as well as the good, it's those intangible things, right? It's the client service, it's the relationships, it's the brand and the trust. And I think that's really what makes, that capital sticky, and more of a long-term view than just fully performance based.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I wonder if from a generational perspective, we'll start to see shifts around how much people want the relationship and how much people want sort of the quick access, and how we're balancing both of those things, right? So quick access to information, easy user experience, but also the relationship kind of coming in as the underpinning that helps, right? Like I feel like you sort of have to balance both very carefully as a financial institution today. We're going to switch over to audience questions here. And I know I already saw one in the chat that I was really interested in from Stephen. Enzo, I know that the FT is sort of originally known as a British publication, but you all have huge editorial readership, massive presence on the US side too. I'm curious if you saw a big difference between the US and UK cohorts here, because I think we have audience members who are sort of sitting on both sides of the pond, and I wonder, is trust perceptions different?
Well, there are regional differences. That's fair to say. I can't remember all of the differences for each data point, and we do have a lot of the differences within the report, which I keep plugging. I would say what's interesting is in more recent studies that we've run. For instance, we run a study amongst institutional investors and financial advisors, measuring awareness of and also perceptions of asset management firms. And particularly this year, when we're asking things around sort of ESG or other topics, which inherently can feed into the trust funnel, right? We are seeing more of a regional difference, particularly in the US versus UK. In ESG, for example, I know this is going slightly off topic. Less of a driver of decisions around choosing asset management firm than it was 12 months ago, for instance. And I think that's probably, most definitely due to decisions that have been made in high government. But as I mentioned I think it was Stephen who asked the question. It's a really good question. I'm happy to follow up and we can go through it in a lot more detail and show you more custom looks on the data by region where there are some differences. But in one of the interesting sections around, not to knock social and influencers, there was definitely a difference by age group there. We did see that in the data. There's a higher levels of trust amongst younger age groups than we saw generally amongst our audience. But again, there are too many cuts to talk about, but happy to follow up with Stephen or indeed anyone on the call, on the webinar rather, to talk you through some of that data.
Absolutely. Another question. I'm rephrasing something that came to me in a private message, but we saw in the research that the trust gap, which is one of the things you kind of added up to, right? Like, where does finance need to be versus where is finance in terms of the trust scale? So I think there's an interesting difference between where does a particular brand stand and where does our industry stand? And how much does the industry reputation sort of impact our individual brands? And I'm curious as to, this is open to anybody, but what do we think are sort of some of the drivers that are causing this massive gap? And how do we as individual institutions sort of contribute to the overall industry perception, which clearly there's a little bit of an industry perception room for improvement, if we could say it that way.
From an industry perspective, I think, it's a lot of, sorry, Enzo, but the media, right? And so, people like salacious headlines and they like to talk about, the bad things that happen. No one's out there talking about how, I can't get the media to pick up when we give a nice donation to charity, you know what I mean? So it's, I think it feeds into it, and it feeds into the, it feeds into the broader narrative around, let's say, like hedge funds are vultures, or private equity firms are, the bad guys. And, so you kind of get this narrative out there, where if you actually look at the business models and the individual companies within, I think each company is different and shouldn't be painted by such a broad industry or, subsector brush. But it's just so much more fun and easier to do it that way, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think it's within, energy, for example, the energy sector has the same, you could make the same comparison to the energy sector. And I think it's just, this is me talking off the belt, but, I think it's having that individuality, standing out above the crowd. If there is a story, be transparent with your customers. And often that can be, articulated through thought leadership, for instance, where, Oaktree or Bailard might have a really interesting story to tell about their organization and how they're operating, to stand out above the crowd. But it's, and I think, we don't need to, people are more intelligent people than me on this call. It's the reasons as to why the finance sector over the last 15, 20 years has suffered. But it's how to kind of, put the head above the parapet, if you like, in terms of standing out in a sector which does have a slightly lower levels of trust compared to others.
Yeah, I think part of it too is it can be pretty opaque also too. So you kind of end up with this covering over what's actually going on, and then a couple of the headlines that stand out, and that seems to be what people remember. One way I think we look at this too is just trying to kind of explain the why, right? Like really what's behind the decision making. And I think, the more we can sort of shrink the distance between what people assume and what's actually happening, I think can kind of help close that a little bit. But yeah, I feel like I've said the same thing a whole bunch of times today, but it really is just that kind of clarity and consistency, I think that plays out in a whole bunch of different ways.
Yeah, and Erin, another thing that's interesting is that we're such a heavily regulated industry also, that sometimes, there's a story out there that I'm like, that's completely incorrect and I want to talk about it, but I can't, right? Because there's regulations around that. And so there, not only, do we have some of those, headwinds, but it's even hard. Sometimes you can't even go out there and speak on behalf of yourself or in defense because of regulations and what you can and can't say publicly. And then you can't even explain that that's the case.
Absolutely. And I think Erin hit on a point that I think is important too, sort of the opaque nature of the industry as a whole, right? There are a lot of people out there who don't understand the things that are happening within the industry, whether in various sectors, right? And helping people, whether they're business leaders or individuals who are investors, et cetera, to understand the industry better, I think is sort of part of the job of everybody on this call, if I were guessing. So, but let's move on to a closing question here. Enzo showed us in the research that kind of where you show up matters, right? So as a brand, the context in which you show up, and we've all thought about this, right? Like halo effects or sort of negative perceptions when your brand is shown in different contexts, right? Even if it's a great item about your brand, if it's in the wrong context, it may not have the impacts that you were hoping for. So, knowing that and knowing that we're looking to build trust, how are you thinking about where you show up, whether that's from a media investment point of view, whether that's an owned point of view, whether you're, working on earned? How are you thinking about where you show up and how that impacts your brand as we look towards 2026?
Yeah, I think part of it is, kind of on the flip side of trying to explain an opaque industry, like the audiences, they're still pretty darn sophisticated, right? Like they understand when the medium does not match the tone, right? When there is that mismatch. And I think that's what starts to kind of breed that distrust. And I think at the end of the day, our industry, there's an awful lot of firms that look an awful lot alike on paper. And so we really are just kind of competing on trust and being able to build that relationship. The media choices then need to reflect kind of the values we hold internally, right? Kind of going back to like the fairness and accountability and the words I love on the wall, right? But sort of choosing channels that kind of give support our message, I think gives more credibility. And I think for me, so kind of looking ahead for next year, what that really means is just being being really selective. and targeted, and sort of thinking about kind of the environment that does reinforce, whether it's brand or values or just really kind of building that trust that we're trying to earn. So I think Lindsay alluded to this earlier, but it's sort of like, can we figure out a way or find those places that can kind of help build that trust, so when things do go wrong, we've got that connection, and on the other side of the table, it's like, okay, yeah, like I'm still willing to walk this road with you, right? I believe we'll get there. So I think that plays out in all sorts of different ways, but I think we've been thinking a lot about how can we be more intentional with media.
I think for Oaktree, I mean, we have a huge thought leadership platform. So we lean into a lot of the owned, and I think there's no better way to build trust than through your own channels, right? It's your own voice. It's the way that you make it. It's your own faces, your own views. And so I think owned is kind of where we lean in. Earned is the icing on the cake, right? And so if someone wants to take one of our thought leadership pieces and they want to publicize it beyond what we're saying, that's great. It's great for you to say something great about yourself. It's even better for someone else to say something great about you.
Well, I would say that clearly, the audiences that particularly Lindsay and Erin trying to communicate with, they're very sophisticated, and they're very hard to reach and very time poor. So I think standing out and being authentic and honest, having that credibility is key. I would say that my team as a function, we do a lot of work to understand behavior of different audiences through our FT ecosystem, if you like. So right down to topic level, behavior, etc. And also we do have many case studies to show how effective paid media can be. So whether it be display or thought leadership, and how they work in tandem, for instance. But yeah, staying true to your brand, being open, transparent, and actually, in terms of labeling, that's a really good point, actually. And we, as I'm sure most people know, there's a very strict church and state thing at the FT. Advertisers, run. We don't, the editorial cannot be influenced by the advertising in our sort of different platforms, which I think is obviously a different conversation, something to have with certain advertisers, but actually it's a straightforward conversation to have in many cases, because there's no gray lines, there's no disparities. I think that stands, that's really important for us, certainly as a business. And that's the core of what we do, right? We're a trusted media brand. We're impartial, etc. So I could wax lyrical about how the FT is a fantastic medium, but I won't. I'll resist the urge. But yeah, get in touch if you want to know more.
But I think that you bring up an interesting point, and sort of this balance between as an institution, or as a place where brands are going to show up, making sure that the FT or any media institution, right? I'm going to put this kind of blanket across. If you are consistently trusted as, I'm going to be able to tell the difference between that advertorial sort of content versus the editorial content. It's going to be made extremely clear, right? The transparency is there. I think that builds quite a lot more in terms of, the reputation. Like when then institutions show up in that publication, what does that mean, right? Like, and I think that changes it a little bit. So I think all fantastic points. I really appreciate this conversation that we've been able to have on stage, and have enjoyed just sort of the back and forth between everyone.